subscribe to my YouTube channel. You won't believe what happens next in this incredible story of fate, family, and unexpected truths. The rain poured heavily on the city streets, turning the sidewalks into shimmering rivers of light as headlights reflected off the wet pavement. Outside the towering glass skyscraper of Westwood Enterprises, a girl no older than 10 stood shivering, clutching a tattered hoodie around her thin frame. People walked past her without a second glance, rushing to escape the storm, but she didn't move. Her wide brown eyes were fixed on the entrance of the building, her small hands curled into nervous fists. Inside, high above the city on the top floor, Billionaire CEO Alexander Westwood leaned against his desk, rubbing his temples. The board meeting had drained him. Another day filled with discussions about profits, expansions, and shareholders' demands. He was used to it, expected it even. But tonight, exhaustion weighed heavier than usual. "Mr. Westwood, there's someone downstairs," his assistant, Claire, said hesitantly as she entered his office. He glanced up, frowning. "Someone, a little girl. She's been standing outside for nearly an hour." "Security should handle it," he muttered, turning back to his laptop. "They tried," Claire admitted, "but she refuses to leave. She says she needs to talk to you." Alexander sighed. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to get his attention with a desperate plea. People assumed that wealth meant generosity, that he was some kind of savior who could fix their problems. But something in Claire's voice gave him pause. "What does she want?" She wouldn't say much, but Claire hesitated, then added, "She said her mother had the same tattoo as you." His head snapped up. "His tattoo?" A cold prickle ran down his spine. It wasn't visible in any of his public photos. He made sure of that. The intricate Celtic knot on his wrist had been inked years ago, a symbol of something deeply personal, something he hadn't thought about in a long time. Alexander's pulse quickened as he pushed back his chair and stood. "Where is she?" Down in the lobby, the girl still stood near the entrance, her small frame dwarfed by the grandeur of the building. Her hoodie was soaked through, her sneakers caked with mud. When the door slid open and Alexander stepped out, she lifted her head. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Hi, sir. My mother had the same tattoo as you." The words sent a strange, electric shock through him. He stared at her, trying to place the familiarity in her eyes, in the delicate curve of her face. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. "Lena. And your mother's name?" She hesitated, then looked down. I don't know if I should say." Something inside Alexander twisted. If this was a scam, it was unlike any he'd encountered before. Most people were eager to tell him their sob story, to drop names and demand things. But this girl, she looked uncertain, scared even. "You came all the way here to tell me that," he said carefully. "Why?" Lena shifted on her feet. "Because she told me if I ever needed help, I should find the man with this tattoo." She pointed to his wrist. "And she said he would know what to do." Alexander's breath caught. The room seemed to shrink around him, the sounds of the city fading into the background. There was only one person who could have said something like that. Only one person who had ever traced her fingers over the ink on his skin and whispered about destiny and promises. But she was gone. She had left years ago. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice to stay steady. "What happened to your mother?" Lena's lip trembled. She's gone, and I don't have anywhere else to go." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. For the first time in years, Alexander Westwood, one of the most powerful men in the country, felt completely unprepared. Because standing in front of him, dripping wet and trembling was a little girl who might just change everything. The silence between them stretched as the weight of Lena's words settled in. Alexander studied the girl's face, searching for answers in her tired eyes. She was young, too young to be out here alone in the middle of the night. Her hands were curled into the sleeves of her damp hoodie, trying to keep warm. Something about her felt familiar, but he couldn't place why. "Come inside," he finally said, his voice quieter than usual. Lena hesitated, shifting on her feet, but eventually nodded. He led her through the lobby, past curious glances from the night staff, and into the elevator. As they rode up in silence, Alexander's mind raced. The tattoo, her mother, the cryptic message. It didn't make sense. He needed answers, but first, this child needed food and warmth. When they stepped into his penthouse, Lena's eyes widened at the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The place was sleek, modern, and cold, more like a luxury hotel than a home. She didn't say anything, just pulled her hoodie tighter around herself. "Sit down," he said, motioning to the couch. "I'll get you something to eat." Lena perched on the edge of the sofa, barely touching it, as if she didn't belong. Alexander disappeared into the kitchen, grabbing a plate of leftover pasta from the fridge and heating it up. When he returned, she was still sitting stiffly, her fingers gripping the fabric of her hoodie. "Here," he said, handing her the plate. She took it carefully, murmuring a small, "Thank you." Before picking up the fork, Alexander sat across from her, watching as she took cautious bites, as if she wasn't used to eating full meals. After a while, he finally spoke. "Tell me about your mother." Lena paused, staring at her plate. Her name was Sophie. Something inside him froze. Sophie. The name hit him like a lightning bolt, dragging him back to a past he had locked away. He hadn't heard that name in years, not since she left without a trace, disappearing like a ghost from his life. His grip tightened on the armrest. Sophie. He swallowed hard. Sophie Bennett. Lena nodded slowly. The air felt too thick to breathe. He ran a hand through his hair, his heart pounding. Sophie had a daughter, and not just any daughter, his daughter. No, that wasn't possible, was it? "How old are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 10, Lena answered, watching him carefully. 10 years. The timeline slammed into him. He and Sophie had been together over a decade ago. She had left suddenly, without a word, without an explanation. And now, here was this little girl, looking at him with eyes that felt like echoes of a past he wasn't ready to face. "Why did she send you to me?" he asked, his voice rough. Lena hesitated. "She didn't want to. She always said I shouldn't look for you. But before she got sick, she told me if anything ever happened to her, I should find the man with the tattoo." She looked down at her hands. "She said you would help me." Sick. His chest tightened. "She was sick." Lena nodded, her voice small. "She had cancer. She tried to fight it, but..." She trailed off, her fingers tightening around the fork. She didn't make it. A strange hollow feeling settled in his stomach. Sophie was gone. The woman he had once loved, the woman who had vanished without a word, was gone forever, and she had left behind this little girl, carrying a secret that had shattered his entire reality. Lena looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Are you my dad?" The question hit him like a freight train. He stared at her, the world tilting on its axis. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He didn't know. He hadn't even considered it. Had been too stunned by everything else. But now, looking at her, really looking at her, he saw it. The shape of her face, the way her nose crinkled slightly when she was unsure, the intensity in her eyes when she spoke. His stomach twisted. I don't know, he admitted honestly. Lena nodded, as if she had expected that answer. She set the plate down carefully and pulled up the sleeve of her hoodie. Alexander's breath caught. There, on the inside of her wrist, was the same Celtic knot, the same design that had connected him and Sophie all those years ago. I don't have proof, Lena said softly. But my mom always said I had a piece of you. Something cracked inside him. For years, he had buried the pain of Sophie leaving. He had convinced himself that she had walked away because she didn't care. But now, staring at this little girl with his past etched into her skin, he realized there had been so much more he never knew. A million questions flooded his mind. Why had Sophie left? Why hadn't she told him? Had she been protecting Lena from something? From him? He exhaled slowly, his voice steady but strained. Lena, I need to know the truth about everything. Lena met his gaze. Then you should read this. She reached into her backpack and pulled out an old worn-out notebook. Sophie's name was written in faded ink on the cover. Alexander took it carefully, his hands suddenly unsteady. As he flipped to the first page, his heart pounded. The past he had buried was about to come rushing back, and with it, secrets that would change everything. Alexander turned the first page of the notebook, his hands tense as his eyes scanned Sophie's familiar handwriting. The words pulled him back in time, unraveling a past he had once locked away. Alexander, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't tell you in person. I wanted to. I almost did so many times. But I was scared. Scared that you wouldn't believe me. Scared that I would ruin the life you had built. But most of all, scared that you might not want her. His breath hitched. The next words made his pulse roar in his ears. Lena is your daughter. Everything around him blurred. He gripped the notebook tighter, his jaw clenching as he read on. I never meant to keep her from you. When I found out I was pregnant, I wanted to tell you. But then, things changed. I heard things, Alexander. Rumors. Your company was under attack. People were watching you. And then, I was threatened. His stomach twisted. I don't know who they were, but they made it clear. If I didn't disappear, they would make me regret it. I was terrified. Not for me, but for our baby. So I did the only thing I could. I ran. I left behind everything, including you, because I thought it would keep her safe. A sharp exhale left his lips. His fingers curled around the edge of the notebook as Sophie's words continued. I always knew the truth would catch up, but by the time I realized I couldn't keep running, I got sick. And suddenly, time was no longer on my side. I should have told you sooner. I should have given Lena the chance to know her father. But if you're reading this now, I hope it's not too late. Please, Alexander, take care of her. The notebook slipped from his fingers, landing softly on the table. He couldn't move. His mind reeled. Lena was his daughter. Sophie had left to protect her, not because she had stopped loving him, but because she had been scared, because someone had threatened her. And now, Sophie was gone, but the people who had forced her to disappear, were they still out there? A sudden urgency gripped him. His gaze snapped to Lena, who sat quietly, watching him with wide eyes. Did your mother ever mention anyone? Anyone she was afraid of? He asked. Lena hesitated, then slowly shook her head. Not really. But sometimes she would get these strange letters. She always threw them away before I could see them. His jaw tightened. Someone had been watching Sophie for years, ensuring she never came back. And now, Lena had walked straight into his world. The very world Sophie had tried to protect her from. He couldn't let anything happen to her. Taking a deep breath, he turned to Lena, his voice steady. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. You're not alone anymore. You have me. Lena's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Hope, fear, maybe both. Are you really my dad? She whispered. His chest ached. He had spent years building empires, making billion-dollar deals. Yet here he was, struggling to find the right words. But when he looked at her, truly looked at her, he saw it. The same fire in her eyes. The same determination. The same Sophie. I am, he said finally. And I'm not going anywhere. Lena blinked, her lower lip trembling slightly. Then, before he could react, she threw herself into his arms, gripping onto him like she was afraid he might disappear too. Alexander wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. In that moment, everything else faded. The business, the money, the past. All that mattered was the little girl in his arms, the little girl he had almost never known. But now, he would protect her with everything he had, no matter what it took.